When you first started advising both publications, how did you feel about giving students editorial control?
It's funny. I started advising my very, very first year of advising. I didn't even know what the law was.
Mm-hmm.
I assumed the students could write what they wanted to write just because that was my attitude. Um, when I got to Redondo, I knew the law a lot better. That was after 2 years of advising. And I've always encouraged them to cover whatever they wanted. Always. And I never really received any blowback about that. Once in a while, parents were upset about things, but it was never a big deal. I feel like there were often vigorous discussions about whether something was a good idea or not. And, even though in the classroom I actually didn't have much legal authority, I certainly had a lot of moral authority because I had credibility with the kids. And when we discussed First Amendment and the California Ed Code, I would make sure that I brought up examples of maybe topics or ways of covering stories that it's not a good idea, and here's why. But the context of that was to empower students. In fact, every once in a while, my newspaper kids would be a little too timid, and I would just kind of talk to them about the Ed Code again and say, guys, you're not really taking advantage of this. What are you so scared of? And sometimes I would do that just to prod them to go a little deeper, or, and I always had, especially on the newspaper, it was about raising hell. And I would always tell them, yeah, raising hell is great, but you do it on the news page, not on the opinion page. You start on the news page and you do some real reporting, and then you move it to the opinion side. And I think they tended to understand that. I think for a lot of students, even in California, the problem, what hangs over their head, it's not about an administration. It's about, well, I think there's always a bit of self-censorship or a danger of that. I think they have, at a school like Redondo, where the kids are pretty well off, I believe that the parents are telling the kids, be careful of who you anger. That they sometimes worry not so much about being censored, but maybe not getting a recommendation that they would want, and things like that. I think that has led to a bit of timid behavior on their parts. But more often than not, I think that what keeps them from really pursuing it is it just takes a lot of work. It's really hard to do the type of digging and interviewing and uncomfortable interviewing. And I think sometimes they're, even in a state like California that probably has the most liberal set of laws, it's literally the Tinker Standard. I think fear and just not having a sense of the resources available to them is what prevents them from doing a lot of reporting. It's certainly not me, because no administrator really wants, unless it's only the worst administrators who want to go over every line of a newspaper or yearbook, because honestly, that job sucks. How does anyone have the time to do that? And if they're that concerned about it, then they are weak in so many other ways that they'll never last. But they don't want that responsibility. They don't want to have to read it. And they get that pretty quickly. They understand that, but also it's because the laws in California are very strong. And so liability will only go in Texas,
yeah.
If a principal gets lazy and you have a terrible advisor, the school will be sued successfully because the laws there allow for that. So liability absolutely falls onto the principal.
You mentioned, sometimes your students are timid for various reasons, whether that's, not wanting to upset the community or the work. But when they have chosen to produce something that's potentially controversial, how do you coach them through, okay, here are the possible reactions, here's how we can potentially address that, and that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, on stories like that, those are the ones where I do the most amount of coaching, um, but the coaching takes the form of asking them hard questions. If they are drawing conclusions of any kind, are they logical? Are they strong based on evidence? It's always worth asking, what's the potential blowback on this? Is there? Is it? And, a lot of it's, are you truly certain? And have you talked to everybody? And have you actually, if you're making an accusation, have you interviewed the people about whom you or others are making accusations? Because you have to do that. In other words, doing good journalism. And things like verify, something like, if it's, it's all general practices. One should keep good notes. One should probably keep recordings of interviews, but on things like this, one has to be very careful about keeping perfect records. I think that's that's really, really important. Fortunately for us, honestly, lousy things rarely happened in our district. It was an honest administration, relatively open. It's a one high school district. So those issues didn't really come up very often. Sometimes I wish they did, right? May you live in interesting times. And people doing bad things is often really fun to cover. But there wasn't much of that over the years. When we dealt with controversial subjects, we made a point early on. We were writing stories about gay students in the early 90s. But at that point, and we were covering those issues. In my very second year of advising in another school, we covered that as well. We even had a teacher who came out, but who spoke to my students, but she wasn't out. And in that environment in 1989, one could not be out. And nor could a young man in 1992 be out. There was just, the chances of literally being murdered were real at that point. But that changed. And so, folks, we got to be safe. We can't do harm to students. And they knew that. But then, it's sort of amazing how quickly that whole atmosphere changed, and how relatively quickly for us, where the kids were out.
For somebody who is new to the yearbook world, what would you tell them if they're trying to figure out how to let go and let the kids do more?
Oh boy. Okay, so the best way to let go is to be thorough in your training of the staff. But that means you have kids for more than 1 year. I'm not sure it's really easy to let go if you only have kids for 1 year. My 21 and 20 books, the EICs had been on staff for 4 years. So what we did, a lot of it has to do with to let go, you have to develop a culture. And a culture where the kids teach the kids. But the whole time, the advisor just needs to keep an eye on the process. And so that's why November was so important to me, because I would see I would always do the basic instruction in writing. But I also worked with my editors to work with writers specifically, so again, that I could let go. With design, and specifically the computer programs, the culture passed on that knowledge. And if that faltered a bit, sometimes it's good to be helpless about it, because then you tell the kid, find a YouTube video on it, or ask our rep when she comes in the next time, or whatever. But one way to empower them is to force them and teach them how to find answers to things. The worst thing an advisor can do is to be an expert at everything, in my opinion. And if you are an expert in everything, at least pretend that you're not. And just make them find things out for themselves. Like, I think in terms of basic writing, they need help. Obviously, they need help in basic photography. But if you have experienced photographers who can do that teaching, that's even better. The peer-to-peer teaching is oftentimes more successful than from the teacher. Um, and I'd say sometimes the only exception is with writing, but not always. I've had kids who tutored kids in writing and AP and in journalism, and I thought they were hopeless, but their friend was able to tutor them better than I could. Mm-hmm. So it's about creating a culture, in my opinion.
All right.
Oh, and I do have one more point. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, you're fine.
No, I just realized the other thing that's super important is to never blindside administrators, no matter what state you're in. I think it's super important to cultivate relationships. I think a smart advisor figures out not only like who are the opinion leaders on campus, because they could kill you with 1,000 small cuts. And so you, in essence, cultivate those relationships. Work with and be helpful with coaches because they can be a pain. But, you know, when at our school, I got along incredibly well with the coaches, and they would bend over backwards sometimes to accommodate us, which is not the typical coach thing. Never blindsided an administrator. Have the discussions with the administrators about, you know, don't you agree that it's better if the kids make the decisions? And say, you know, share some topic and share those anecdotal stories about how kids made really good decisions. But that also means cultivating a relationship with the principal, which is super important. And then just step back and don't be defensive. Even if you have to go home and drink a couple of glasses of wine that night, try not to explode and just come up with useful approach. But it's harder, it's easier for everybody if you keep those lines of communication open.